Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and talk to you about my work. Like they said, I'm a PhD student with Dan Sains in New York University. So the primary problem I want to impress upon you today is that voices and vocalizations are highly variable signals, but different types of variants can convey different types of information. So here's just 4 words, hot, hat, hit, and head, spoken by 2 different speakers. And you can see that there's subtle variants across both different words that convey very different semantic information. And there's also subtle differences in, for example, the formant and other acoustic features that would allow you to tell the difference between speaker 1 and speaker 2. So that for the first part of natural vocal processing, we know that speech comprehension requires generalizing across these interspeaker differences. On the flip side of that, we also know that social species perform identity recognition despite all of this natural variance. So a classic example of that is babies can recognize the sound of their mother's voice the first day that they're born. And an example from the animal world comes from naked mole rats, where if you present a vocalization from the animal's own colony, they reliably will call back and produce this antiphonal response. Whereas if you present a chirp from a different colony that the animal did not grow up with, it produces no response. And so clearly there's some acoustic difference in this seemingly very similar signal that the animal can recognize and change its behavior. So identity recognition, however, requires generalizing across this intra-speaker differences across different iterations of similar calls. The neural mechanisms underlying these 2 processes have been well studied, but I'd say the identity recognition mechanisms are lesser well known. So that leads me to my project that's mainly asking, how does the brain perform both this generalization and identification from these same vocal signals? For this project, I'm using the Mongolian gerbil, and our lab uses them for a few different reasons, but importantly for this study, they have a rich and family-specific vocal repertoire. So their vocalizations have been well characterized by others and our own lab. These are examples of syllables that gerbils produce in a natural family context. Their vocalizations range from the ultrasonic range to these more sonic vocalizations, and importantly, the usage of these vocalizations differs depending on the family of gerbils that you record them from. So for my neural experiment, I'm going to probe auditory cortex with a large set of these vocal variants or syllables to try to get at this generalization and identification question. To collect that large stimulus set, what I did is I recorded vocalizations from a family of gerbils in an enlarged home cage just over one night when the pups were postnatal day 25 to 27, which is the sort of late end of their juvenile stage before they've been weaned from their families. Then I'm going to use a deep neural network to be able to automatically extract all of the vocalizations that the gerbils produced. And I took an unsupervised approach to reduce the spectrograms of the vocalizations into a low-dimensional space so that I could perform clustering to end up with a stimulus set of different categories of vocalizations. And so these are the 4 categories that I'm going to use and talk about in this talk. We have these downward frequency modulated calls that we can hear, these 2 ultrasonic categories, up FMs and warbles, and then these combination calls that combine different features from the other categories. So I did this and extracted hundreds and thousands of vocalizations from not just 1, but 3 different families of gerbils. And that ended up with giving us a stimulus set of over 1,500 individual variants or syllables that I'm going to present to the animal. And now that allows me to answer these 2 questions. One is, how does the auditory cortex generalize across identity to perform this categorization? And how does the auditory cortex discriminate identity within a vocal category? Great. So in the actual physiology experiments, I implanted 5 adult Mongolian gerbils in their left auditory cortex using high-density silicon probes. And the animals are not engaged in an active task. They're passively listening to the vocalizations being presented from an overhead speaker. And then, at the end of the experiment, I performed histology just to confirm where my electrode tracks ended up. Okay, great. So this is a single cell from one of the animals I recorded from, and it's on the top is its average response to the many thousands of trials of when I presented a downward frequency modulated call. And I'll just remind you that there's over 300 individual down FM syllables in here, and each one's presented 5 times throughout the course of the experiment. This is that same cell, but responding to all 4 of the vocal categories I presented in this session. And as you can see, there's both differences in the firing rate of the cell when you look at the top average traces, but also in the temporal pattern across the trials. So we could say that both based on possibly firing rate, but definitely temporal pattern, that this cell has some category selectivity. When we look at the single unit responses to family identity, so now I'm looking at all the combination trials in the experiment, but restricting each column as a different family of gerbils that produce those combination calls. Here's an example of a cell that responds reliably throughout the session to combination calls, but family 1 and 2's response is lower and has a slightly different temporal pattern than the response to family 3 calls. So here's those average traces overlaid, and examples of single units that we are statistically modulated by family identity from the other vocalization categories. Okay, so we have evidence that there's different patterns in at the single unit level for both category and family identity. And so that led us to ask at the population level, how is auditory cortex using these single neurons to perform categorization and identification? So to do that, I'm using a linear decoder called an SVM, or a support vector machine, that essentially allows me to ask how the population activity for one category, if it's linearly separable for the population activity to all the other categories, and that's for the vocal type decoder. And to decode family identity, we do the exact same type of analysis, but now we're asking to separate the population activity of one family from the other. And a technical detail here is that we were interested in whether the animal's own family was represented differently. So there's only 2 families that are kept constant across subjects, so that's why we're doing a 2-family decoding analysis here, but we'll get back to that. Okay, so if I pool all the responsive cells that I recorded from the 5 animals, we can very reliably decode the vocal category, the vocal types from the whole population with 85 to 95% accuracy. And if we look at the level of single animals where there's different numbers and smaller numbers of responsive cells, we still can reliably decode vocal type. So this suggests that vocal categories are robustly represented by the auditory cortex and are pretty invariant to this family identity axis. If I again look at all the single units from all the animals, we can also reliably decode family identity, again restricting the analysis to one category at a time. So here we can decode the identity of the family that produced the combination calls at around 75% compared to where chance here would be 50%. And again, if we look at the single animal level, we can do this as well. And we get a similar result when we look across the 4 vocal categories that I looked at in this experiment. Okay, so just to conclude and summarize, I showed you that I have recorded single units that are category responsive and single units that are modulated by the identity of the family that produce those different vocalizations. And we think those single units are underlying the auditory cortex's ability to both generalize and perform categorization and to perform social identification within those categories. So I'll just like to thank my lab, thank all of you for listening, of course thank the gerbils, and my poster is on Thursday if you'd like to talk about this anymore. Thank you.
So, questions for Estelle, please. Yeah.
Thank you for tossing short so I wouldn't be embarrassed, Lori. I appreciate that. This was great. Thank you. It would be nice to know if the categorization of families was somehow more than what we would expect given the acoustical differences between the families' calls. Have you tried any way to kind of pick that apart, whether this is just spectrotemporal tuning or something more categorical?
I've looked at it, so if you look at the acoustics, you can decode family, so that was like check number 1. Comparing the performance of family decoding and neural decoding, I actually haven't done that specific analysis, but yeah, I mean, I would expect it is going to be due to a lot of spectrotemporal tuning, whether there's like some transformation that enhances that signal. At the level of primary auditory cortex, I'm not super sure, but yeah.
Thank you.
Should I just yell? Hello. That was really interesting and cool, and go gerbils. So on a related note, do you actually see a preference for, so if you're from family one, is there any difference? Are you like more excited to hear family one?
No, we... No.
Yeah, it could be like, oh my God.
That was like what we were looking for and why we built that into the stimulus set. We didn't find any evidence. We looked at just, are there more cells responsive to own, family, or other? We find it's pretty similar across the three. So we think this is more not necessarily like recognition or something of your own family, but just the ability to discriminate across these different families is how we're thinking about it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think maybe I have a similar question, so it looked like the combination calls were the family was more discriminable for one category than others, and I guess you could imagine that there might be some vocalizations that are actually useful to encode from other families, if they're, so I guess, and you said you know something about the semantic meaning of the vocalizations, and I guess I just wonder if there's some logic where they might be more able to discriminate certain categories than others.
Yeah, we know like qualitatively, like the UpFMs, for example, are an affiliative like hello call. The warbles seem to be in these more like high arousal states. We think maybe the combination calls are slightly more because they're combinations of two different sometimes. So like if you can extract information from the warble part and the down FM part, maybe that like enhances your ability very slightly to do that.
Right. Okay. So they have more spectrotemporal complexity too. So I guess you gotta
maybe, yeah.
So you can control for that.
All right. Thanks so much,
Thank you.
Estelle.